Hello, it's Phillip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers in London. Looking at a book which I thought fascinating because of a lot of reasons. It's called Colditz, Prisoners of the Castle. It's been written by Ben Macintyre and it's come to us from Penguin Books Limited. It's an interesting book. It's a hardback at the moment. Ben is an excellent writer from the Times. He produces a lot of important work certainly in military matters and in intelligence matters and political matters, and this actually links a whole range of them together. I've given it a title, probably the first recounted history of Colditz, where all the players are now dead. And I think that's quite an important point, because what Ben has done with this book is he's looked at sources. I've been fortunate enough to meet some of these people, so therefore I see it in a different way as a much older guy. But I did think this was a first-class book. Let's have a look at it first of all. There's the front, and there's the spine, and then there's the back. A lot of photographs, a lot of well-known people who are featured in it. That's Ben at the back. The inside cover actually has a lot of nice photographs as well. There is actually an index by page numbering, which is quite useful if you're looking for a particular person or particular activity. The front of the book, as you see, there's the front cover. Then you've got the spine, the dust sheet, and so forth. You've got, again, a nice lot of pictures throughout. There's a lot of photography in this book, which I liked actually, because it's historic. To me, it's a piece of history. There's the actual front page. Then there's a nice a dedication quote. We don't review books we don't like, and there's no point in my view, because if you've written time to write a book, it's an important work. A lot of work goes into it, and I don't see why one should be critical of it unless it's a good point. There's the contents section, running through 18 pages, 18 chapters. The last one's called End Game. Then you've got the aftermath, some of the things that happen to some of the people, and then you've got a whole series of appendices, and I'll talk about the codes later. There's a list of illustrations, then you've got a map of the castle, just a map of Germany showing where Colditz is during the Third Reich. Then there's a map of the castle itself. It's a funny place, the castle. It's well worth visiting. You can see it looks huge from those drawings there, but when you visit it today, of course, it's been a hotel, so it looks rather different from the gaunt way it looked in those days. Preface, written by Ben, I think. Then there's a prologue. So I frankly can't. Prologue, Franz Joseph, and that actually is a very interesting little story in its own right. Then we start in 1914. He takes it in date order. He talks about the beginning, and he follows it through in a similar way to the way that Pat Reed did his two books, The Colditz Story and The Latter Days of Colditz. Now, I'm not going to show too many, but I'll show you photographs, a lot of photographs. I'm not going to show too many of them. Again, quite interesting. You certainly get a feel for. That's the liberation at the end. You get a feel for the castle from the book itself. It runs to just under 400 pages. It's an important book for me because I come from that period in history where I served in the armed forces, and I met many people, and I've been to a number of different parts of the world. So for me, it was a bit of a trip down memory lane in many ways. He's making a lot of points which probably hitherto were matters which we didn't want to talk about in the past, but which are part and parcel of things in the armed forces, especially the army, which of course people like Robert Graves exposed after World War I, and that made him pretty unpopular. But of course today we have a different approach. So what do I say about the book? This is a good book for anyone interested in history. Ben Macintyre is probably the first writer to cover exploits of Colditz beyond the years of living memory. And Ben is the master storyteller of real-life espionage, and that's actually a lot to do with what happened. He examines World War II's most notorious prison at the town of Colditz, which runs at the bottom of a hill, and there's a stream. And it's got what is described here as a rich cast of colourful characters who attempted to break free from its walls. And it's a special book, in my view, about special prisoners gleaned from written sources, because they're all passed on. Colditz is described in this way, and a lot of people may not know much about Colditz. So it's a forbidding Gothic castle on a hilltop in the heart of Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany, of course, 1933 to 1945 dictatorship. And where, this is Colditz, is where an unlikely band of British officers and others spent the Second World War plotting daring escapes from their Nazi captors. And this is the original storyline of Colditz, which has remained unchallenged during living memory for those who suffered. But of course, that story then offered only part of the truth, because Ben discloses subject matter that the prisoners, who were members of the armed forces and therefore bound by certain things at the time, would be most unlikely to discuss themselves. The question really is, do we need to know about all of this? The answer is probably yes, for the benefit of historians and for the critics of the armed forces and war generally. And I'll say something about this too, and that is that we, as people who've been in the armed forces, will have the memories anyway. And it doesn't really matter, in my view, what we say and what we tell our relatives, because what we've got here is information gleaned from the written record. Yes, it's an astonishing inside story, as it's described, revealing for the first time by Ben, who describes his book as a tale of the indomitable human spirit, but also one of class conflict, homosexuality, espionage, insanity and farce. And they're all there, and they always have been there. It's just that we haven't chosen to talk about that. And after the Second War, there were very strict limits, even stricter limits really on talking than we had perhaps in the early years, although many families never wanted to talk really amongst themselves about what had happened, certainly after World War One. And in World War Two there was a more open approach, but in fact there were, of course, many people who suffered traumas of whatever type you want to call it because of what had happened. And that, I think, is something we always have to bear in mind. And I've been privileged, of course, over my long life to have met some of the people who are mentioned in this book. And I would like to think most of them would be quite horrified at what he's actually written, if they actually knew that he'd actually produced this information. But it was going to happen at some stage, and I'm glad we have someone of Ben Macintyre's calibre to do it. It's also probably quite pleased, I think, and some of them will be quietly pleased in some cases that the story has now come out, because there is an approach, especially with more senior officers, about the way they may be viewed. And of course, history is never kind to quite a few people. Well, of course, the other thing is their relatives may be quite pleased as well, of course. Through what's been an astonishing range of material, studiously researched, Ben compiles a remarkable list of characters. I'm not going to start mentioning people. It's wider than previously seen and hitherto hidden from history. And there are people who are mentioned that we've never actually really heard of much before. All the usual suspects are there, but there are people we didn't know much about. And there are a lot of reasons which are explained by the author. But he puts it, when he says they've been previously hidden from history, the suggestion is it was deliberate, and I think probably it was. But I think, as I said, it's a piece of history now. What the author does describe are prisoners and captors living cheek by jowl in a thrilling game of cat and mouse. And that actually all the way through, from the German guards to the actual prisoners themselves, you see the behaviour on both sides. And I can remember terrible attitudes after the World War II, when there was confrontation between captors and captives. And it's an important thing to bear in mind, because there was tremendous resentment and very substantial anger at what we found. Specifically, I'm talking about Germany, but it's more wider than that because of what happened in Southeast Asia. But certainly in Europe, the problem there was what we actually found the Germans had done. And I think and other people, and that I think is important. The story, of course, covers, and I'll mention this, the Indian doctor whose hunger strike and eventual escape from another camp reads like a thriller. And it is actually, because he was a very brave guy. He also, Ben describes America's oldest paratrooper and least successful secret agent. Yes, and rather more poignantly, the soldier prisoners of Colditz, who were astonishingly imaginative in their escape attempts. And it's worth visiting the Imperial War Museum to see some of the stuff that they actually used. It's also worth visiting the Masons Museum, actually, in central London, because they had a number of exhibitions, because there were Masons, and the Masonic system was used, of course, quite extensively. Many other ways to survive in the camp whilst their fate remained unknown and in the balance are well described now as a piece of history. It's been carefully researched as a book. I found it wonderful to read, I have to say. It's full of incredible colour, as is the place. My mother visited Colditz for a lot of reasons, which I'm not going into, and she's now passed away, but I have the photographs, and they are very moving, is all I'll say. This is a definitive historical statement of one of the great war stories of the 20th century, now retold when everybody's dead. So thank you, Ben. I'm grateful for this. If you, as the reader, ever visit Lower Saxony, do visit the castle and the museum. I gather that they've spruced it up a bit, as they have with the one at Staglow 3. But I hope certainly that it's a place for people to go to realise what courage was actually being portrayed. And if that's probably not the right word, but the courage on display, certainly, and the fact that they were fighting a really tough time. There's one last point, and that is they very nearly starved to death. And it's important to remember how terrible it was right at the end. The date of publication of this hardback edition is the 15th of September 2022. Now I'm going to mention one last thing, because at the back, having been in the intelligence corps, I found this fascinating. There is a very interesting little, after the aftermath, I'll get there in the end, and all the people. It's the 560 code, and it's well worth reading, because you get an idea of how the information was coming back. It mentions, I'm not going to mention people, it shows you how the codes work, and it also just gives you a fairly good idea, if you're interested in that sort of thing, about how it worked. And I will say that of course is the route taken by the Prominenti, and then there's a note on sources at the end, and of course Q have the biggest sources of the lot. I will say one passing comment at the end, and that is that the value of this book, I think, is that we're getting a totally different approach, and one that I think will be of great benefit to people who read this as history. They may know what their forefathers did or whatever happened, and there may be all sorts of discussions. There are obviously the interviews on television, and but here you actually have a look which is a totally different approach. So thank you very much, Ben, and all the people who've been involved in producing this work. I actually think it's a tribute to the people who suffered so badly, and I'm grateful. Thank you.